Hello, I'm Dr. A. Jacob W. Reinhardt, the New York Theologian. Thank you for joining me today for episode NYTheo Free, Why Thomistic Philosophy. If you're interested in being notified about new content, please subscribe on Substack for free and receive both written articles and podcasts by email and in the Substack app. Or please subscribe on YouTube for my video content. You can also support the work of the New York Theologian by going to buymeacoffee.com/New York Theologian. Why Thomistic philosophy? My work is focused around five key areas, and I want to provide an introduction to each of these. I briefly described them in my introductory podcast, episode number one, but this talk is an introduction to Thomistic philosophy. In this area, as with the other five areas, I plan to explain, develop, and defend them in my work. First, I want to talk about beginnings in philosophy. The philosophy of the scholar from the Middle Ages named Thomas Aquinas is an important area to me. While some of you may see the term theologian as something dry, academic, and unpractical, the term philosopher is even more likely to generate a groan if you introduce yourself as such. That's why I'm not the New York philosopher. But the practice of philosophy, as I envision it, has to do with important first principles. Things like, how do we know there's a real world? How do we know that anything is true or real? Theoretical issues concerning how language works, and even a bit of interaction with how we can know there are right and wrong. Philosophy is rightly viewed as the handmaid of theology, but we also must beware of human philosophy. This is what the Bible has in mind when it says in Colossians 2:8, be careful that no one takes you captive through philosophy, human philosophy, and empty deceit based on human tradition, based on the elements of the world rather than Christ. Colossians 2:8 in the Christian Standard Bible. I doubt that a defense of Christianity's truthfulness is even possible without some of the prerequisites that are described as areas of philosophy. Admittedly, I've had the least training professionally in this area compared to some of the other five key areas. However, I can trace the influence of Thomism on my life for a long time. During my first Bible college experience in 2006, I was assigned for a class on defending Christianity, a book. And it was in this class that I was assigned the work Christian Apologetics, written by the Thomistic philosopher, apologist, theological scholar Norman L. Geisler. And I, believe it or not, have the original copy still with here in my hands that I read 20 years ago. Have a lot of good memories from that class. Some as it pertains to the defense of the truthfulness of Christianity, a popular Thomistic contribution is the five ways of proving God's existence as a precursor to defending the truth of Christianity centered in Jesus Christ. Well, I didn't know it at the time 20 years ago. Geisler's book was an early exposure to Thomistic type thinking. Later, I was also impacted by Geisler's approach to the preambles of theology called Prolegomena, as he laid out 11 foundation ideas that make Orthodox, evangelical, and fundamentalist, in my opinion, theology possible. So there's five areas of Thomistic philosophy that I want to focus on to introduce you to why this is important. I write from and I'm speaking from the more existentialist Thomistic stream than the phenomenological Thomism. Uh, that means my focus on things as they actually are rather than just how people are reacting to objects. That's philosophical jargon there, keeping it simple. Additionally, has been implied, I think, by what I've already said, some Protestants accept Thomistic philosophy. However, while it's notable that even some Catholics disagree with Thomas too. So this isn't exactly a distinction between Protestantism and Catholicism, though some think that they are very closely wedded, Catholicism, and that's not where I am. So What areas does Thomistic philosophy touch? And there's 5 areas I'm going to think of when it comes to philosophy. Very rudimentary, very basic introduction. First, there's realism. Thomistic philosophy is realist in that the world actually exists apart from our thoughts about them. If we understand scripture, the Bible, to teach that God is eternal, then God must have had existence apart from our thinking about him, certainly. Even God, it would be a very strange thing for God to be thinking and not and only exist when he thought. Older movie now in the 1990s called in the early 2000s called The Matrix was based on the premise that the world of humanity was basically unreal, existing only in the mind of the one inside in some kind of machine. Don't quote me on the details of that movie, but that was the basic premise of it. But it's interesting that while they're presenting this idea that we're just in this simulation, it actually points that the Matrix is still real. So in some ways, the movie actually still supports if we're doing movie theology, which I don't normally, it still points to the idea that the Matrix, there is something real outside of people's minds. So the contrast to realism is called idealism. That's where idea thinking, that we're thinking something and that's what activates something to become real. So it's interesting though that you can see that you almost it's almost in the category of unaffirmable. You can't say that there's nothing real because you point to the fact that something's real by saying that. The second area that Thomistic philosophy affirms is the classical view of God, classical theism. And certainly there's other ideas of God, but this philosophy affirms that God is simple, that he is not made up of component parts. He is self-existent. The theological term that I've been teaching to my son is aseity. He's young, got to teach him young, but we've got his simplicity. He is self-existent. God is eternal. He is unchanging, that he has exhaustive knowledge of the future as it concerns the world that he created, and he's omnipotent, and that he can do anything that is possible to do. But God cannot do something that's impossible because there's a distinction there. While these attributes that I've just described there can be discovered from Scripture, the point here is that Scripture also affirms that, quote, God's invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. And as a result, people are without excuse. Romans 1:20. So that text points to that through creation, apart from Scripture, we can understand God's eternal power, certainly calling to mind omnipotence, and his divine nature. It's not unreasonable that something of God's attributes would be discoverable by humans apart from Scripture in this category of philosophy. And the two never contradict, theology or philosophy, but typically it's pointed out, for example, that say the Trinity, God's existence in three persons, is not something knowable by human reason, and Aquinas agreed it was a mystery. But we can know something about the Trinitarian theistic God in creation, and we can know he exists through the classical proofs of God, those 5 ways that I mentioned. Uh, Not going to get into those in detail, but there's going to be some resources you could look at in the written article on my website. But God, the reason this is philosophy is that God is the most basic metaphysical reality. Like, what was there before the physical world? Metaphysical, like before that, in essence. Without God, nothing else would exist. And yet, he himself has always existed and will never not exist. And he is unchanging. Third distinctive to draw attention to is Thomistic philosophy affirms that we can speak meaningfully about the infinite God, but only in an analogous way. This means that while God is unlike us, so far beyond us, we're not forced to use words that have no connection to how he actually exists. Like, skeptics treat this issue to conclude that we can't even describe God, even if he existed. They remain entirely skeptical, entirely uncertain of, I don't know if God exists, because they think that if God existed, we could never speak of him because he was so beyond us, finite humans. And we can really get things wrong on this when we emphasize humans' finitude, our limitedness so much. So we may not be able to speak about God exactly as he is, but when we speak about God, for example, as loving, we mean that he loves in a way similar to our way of loving, but that he's loving in an infinite way, whereas us in a finite way. And it's if you emphasize God's transcendence so much, you that's what leads you to that agnosticism and being an atheist. Aquinas's defense of analogous language about God is crucial to making possible a revelation from God in human language, such as the Bible. And so the concept, if you're someone who's familiar with a little bit with reading the Bible, you're maybe familiar with the big word anthropomorphism. So a generation ago, it's common for preachers in my kind of tradition would refer to that. And an anthropomorphism is where God is spoken of in terms that are like humans. That's where God is described as having an arm or having eyes or ears. Those are analogous ways to speak of God. He is not physical. Most people who have heard that kind of preaching know that God is not a physical being. He does not have a physical body. And yet they instinctively understand that God has, in a sense, those faculties. He can see, perceive what is going on, even though he doesn't have physical eyes. So this subject of that frankly comes from, among other, it's not the only tradition, but Thomistic philosophy helps on this by making the defense that we can have analogous speech about God, and that our speech about him is not merely equivocal, like totally different, or that we can't speak exactly as God is because he is infinite either. Number four, Thomistic philosophy affirms a place for both faith and reason in discovering truth. I may be a little bit more at this time on the reason side of this. And there's a bit of debate about how Thomas really held this relationship between the two exactly. He's characterized as faith isn't needed, but that's a gross misrepresentation. He had a robust understanding. I know this at least for sure from reading things by like Geisler, that there is a place for faith and reason. We do not need proof. This is how I kind of think about this issue as I've read. We may not need proof of everything God reveals because if we know he has revealed it, then we know it is true, even if we haven't seen it. He's God. He's omniscient. He knows everything. He's the absolute most trustworthy witness. But we can also move from things we see and reason about to lead to a reasonable conclusion that whatever we're studying is true. I believe for the most part that's how it's supposed to work with God's existence, reasoning to see the basis of faith and then make that absolute faith decision. But the problem is so many in the world, when you think of the air we breathe, not the literal air, but the cultural air that we breathe, we're supposed to assume often the subtext is naturalism. The belief is that all that exists is natural, and that leads many to miss God's existence through the creation. And so, reasoning, asking questions, even as I was just talking with someone today, sometimes maybe that can help people to get think. So I need to do more reflection on the relationship of faith and reason, but Aquinas's thought is perhaps no better to help deal with the tension between these two areas, in my opinion. Fifth, and finally, I would conclude here that Thomistic philosophy includes a sympathy to natural law. In theological categories, natural law relates to general revelation of right and wrong in our conscience, and you can see Romans 2:14 and 15 on that. There is more to natural law than just conscience, as it includes the idea that proper reasoning can lead one to the conclusion that certain deeds are morally right and some are morally wrong. Aquinas rooted natural law in God's eternal law, but when you have this kind of reasoning about what is right and wrong, sometimes the negative result is what makes it clear that something is wrong. And for example, it is wrong for a person to kill another living human being because that other person has the right to life. And the other person's murder of the other is a deprivation of that person's right to life. Even the American founding, arguably, is based on a conception of natural law, as it affirms that certain rights are self evident, as found in the Declaration of Independence. Those words self evident implicitly invoke the concept of natural law, and there's a lot of discussion that could be had about that. But just that gives you a flavor that natural law is part of the story here too, that Aquinas helps to contribute, and that's a very important area for understanding, in my opinion, the future of political theology, for how Christians can speak to the public square in a way that maintains the Baptist distinctives of religious liberty, but also calling for certain ethical guardrails and not just unlimited liberty. In conclusion, my work will focus on Thomistic philosophy as well as my other four areas. That does not mean that I follow Aquinas uncritically or that I agree with him in everything. Some are being accused right now of being too Thomistic, I guess, put it that way. Certainly, I am also, though, as I've pointed out, this is the first in a five-part series of my five distinctives, but I am also a traditional dispensational, classic free grace, fundamental Baptist, and we'll talk about each of those in the next few weeks. Each of these areas clash with various aspects of Thomas Aquinas' full theology as a Roman Catholic in the Middle Ages. It's true, Martin Luther, the German reformer, was particularly critical of Aquinas' type of a theology. But in my opinion, other reformers, I think there's good evidence for this. Other reformers were more reliant on the scholastic tradition that Aquinas represented than they were given credit for. There was a significant resurgence of Thomistic philosophy a generation ago, the era of Geisler that I've mentioned, but also R.C. Sproul, a Reformed theologian, when both of them died about 10 years ago or so. In the current era, there's a growing movement toward classical theology or retrieval theology. And the word retrieval may be a little weird, but if you see it online, it's talking about going back and it, as a Baptist, it feels like they're just going back to emphasizing the creeds more, but not just the creeds of Christianity, going further than that. Uh, and there's a concern that these people focusing on classical theology are moving toward Roman Catholicism, Anglicanism, or Eastern Orthodoxy. Don't assume that I'm exactly identified with those movements. I saw a blog post of last week by Sean Wright titled "The Good and Bad of Retrieval Theology" on the Gospel Coalition. You can go look it up. He had some good thoughts, I think, about that I mostly agreed with, even though he and I are probably coming from some different places in some of the broader theological issues. I think when you take, as I do, Thomistic philosophy with the other four doctrinal areas that I emphasize, there's a protection against turning Roman Catholic and denying the gospel thereby. No one opposed the increasing rapprochement of Roman Catholic theology and evangelicalism than the neo-Thomist philosopher theologian R.C. Sproul in the 90s. In conclusion, the truths I believe that Thomistic philosophy contribute flow either from general revelation, anything explicitly about God or the natural law, or from God's common grace. Certainly, other Christian philosophies may incorporate some of these views, and if they do, great. However, as a package, I believe there is something helpful and indeed true in Thomistic philosophy. I believe that his philosophy represents a promising solution to the modernism and postmodernism that has undermined Christian faith the last 2 centuries. Thomism is an expression of pre modern philosophy. It lays the foundation in many respects for the rest of the truth by helping establish realism, classical theism, analogous religious language, a proper synthesis between faith and reason, and natural law. I look forward to giving it more attention in my research and writing. Next week, we will consider the topic of traditional dispensationalism. Why traditional dispensationalism? Take care. Bye bye.